On the evening of Sunday, March 12, 2006, 23-year-old Rost Khan bounded up the steps of Northwick Park Hospital in London, England. He was running late for the start of a clinical trial that promised to pay him £2,000 in exchange for just 3 days of work as basically a human guinea pig. But to a recent university graduate like Rost, this was incredible money. £2,000 would be more than enough for him to catch up on his many unpaid bills and put some away as savings. But if he missed the start of the trial, he was worried they wouldn't even let him in. So even though Rost hated running, he pushed himself to sprint the rest of the way up the stairs to the second floor, and then he jogged down the dingy beige hallway to the waiting room. Once inside, he found a group of men already seated around a conference table, each with a little packet of papers in front of him. A doctor in a white lab coat walked over to him, saying he must be Rost Khan, their very last volunteer. Rost nodded, his hands on his hips, trying to stop panting. He was just grateful he'd made it. Once Rost caught his breath, he sat down at the conference table and looked around and nodded a quick hello to the other men, and then he looked down at the packet of papers as the doctor in the lab coat explained that for this trial, they'd be testing an experimental drug called TGN-1412. It was designed to strengthen the body's immune system so that it could fight off cancers like leukemia. If the drug worked, it might allow cancer patients to avoid the agony of long and painful chemotherapy treatments. And so far, TGN-1412 had been tested successfully in animals, and so now it was cleared for a human trial. The doctor proudly announced that this group of men would be the first to be given the drug to see how the human body responded to the medicine. When Rost heard this, he sat up a little bit straighter. He'd done a few clinical trials before, and none of them had felt very important. But a drug that might cure leukemia could save countless lives, and so he thought it was really cool that he got to be a part of something that could potentially make medical history. The doctor told the men that tonight, the medical staff would take their vitals and give them all the same late-night snack. Then they would spend the night at the hospital. In the morning, they'd receive the drug, and for 3 days after that, they would be carefully monitored to see if they experienced any side effects from taking this drug. And that was it. Then they'd go home and would just need to come back for a few follow-up tests. The doctor beamed as he explained that once they knew how healthy people reacted to this drug, they could then test it on volunteers who actually had leukemia. Next, the doctor started reviewing a list of bullet points about how the drug was supposed to work, and as he did this, Ross sort of tuned it out and just began looking around the table at the 7 other men sitting there, and most of them were in their 20s and 30s. But as he looked around, Rost noticed that all the eyes at the table were actually turning to him now. It took a moment for him to realize that the doctor had actually asked Rost a question and was waiting for the answer. Sheepishly, he apologized and then asked the doctor to please repeat himself. The doctor cleared his voice, and then he said again what Rost had not heard. He said there were risks involved in this trial, real risks. Test subjects could possibly break out in hives, or even go into a life-threatening anaphylactic shock. The doctor then turned to Rost and asked if those risks gave him any second thoughts about joining this experiment. But Rost just kind of shrugged like it was no big deal, because for him, at all the trials he had been at, doctors always sounded this way, talking about the risks as being so bad. Are you sure you want to proceed? But honestly, Rost had already made up his mind. Besides, the trial had already been approved by the government, and all the participants were already in a hospital, so if something went wrong, they were in the right place. So Rost said, yep, no second thoughts. After Rost gave his approval along with the other men at the table, the doctor began splitting the men into 2 groups of 4. Rost was sent with 3 other men to a place the doctor called Trial Bay 1, while the other 4 participants headed to Trial Bay 2. Rost followed his group into a big white-walled room with 4 hospital beds. A desk and some cabinets had been shoved into the corner of the room, suggesting the room was normally used as an office. But tonight, it would be Trial Bay 1, complete with patient privacy curtains hanging from the ceiling. Rost and the other patients settled into their hospital bed inside of their curtained cubicles and waited for their snacks. And then after that, around 10 p.m., the lights went out, and Rost tried to get some sleep. The next morning, Rost woke up when a nurse called out good morning to the whole group and then flicked on the overhead lights. It was 7:30 a.m., which meant they had half an hour before the trial officially started. Rost stumbled out of bed and made his way to the bathroom down the hall. He wanted to change out of his pajamas and into some sweatpants before the trial actually got started. And after changing, when he got back to the trial bay, all of the curtains were now pushed back so that the room was now one big open space again. The nurse then asked Rost to please climb back into his bed, and then she explained that she was about to hook him up to a heart rate monitor. That way, nurses and trial leaders could monitor any cardiac symptoms while he was on this medication. While the nurse taped wires to Rost's chest, a man entered the room and introduced himself as Dr. Daniel Bradford. He explained that he was the lead doctor on the trial and that the dose of TGN 1412 they'd be receiving was scaled back dramatically from the highest dose they tried during animal testing. This way, the men would only get a tiny fraction of the animal dose. Dr. Bradford said that each of them would get an injection in their arms. One volunteer would be injected every 10 minutes until they had all been infused. However, only 6 of the 8 volunteers would actually receive the experimental drug. The other 2 volunteers would just be receiving a placebo, like sugar water, just for comparison purposes. Nobody, not even Dr. Bradford himself, would know who received the drug and who didn't. Rost knew this was completely normal in medical research, and it reminded him that these researchers were very serious. When the clock finally struck 8 a.m. and it was time to start, Rost watched as a nurse gave the first infusion to the patient in the bed that was next to Rost, a man whose name was David. David had told Rost the night before that he was getting married in a few months, and like everyone else in the trial, he'd signed up to make some quick cash. He wanted to pay off his credit card debt before starting this brand new life with his fiancée. The nurse slid an IV needle into David's arm and then hooked the IV tube up to a small machine. She turned it on, and then a clear liquid began flowing out of the machine and down the tube into David's arm. She told David to relax until the bag of fluid was empty, and then she looked across the bed to Rost and told him that she'd start his infusion in precisely 10 minutes at 8:10 a.m. As Rost waited for his turn, he grabbed a book off the bedside table and flipped through the pages, but he couldn't concentrate enough to actually read. He kept stealing glances at David to see if, maybe David was negatively reacting, but Rost was pleased to see David looked perfectly calm. At 8:10 a.m., the nurse came to Rost's bedside, and for some reason, Rost's stomach began fluttering with nerves. He told himself everything was fine and tried to look nonchalant as the nurse wiped the inside of his elbow with antiseptic and then stuck him with the IV needle. Rost began looking around the room to distract himself. The liquid drug felt cool as it flowed into his forearm and up into his shoulder. He actually shivered a bit, trying his best not to move. And then finally, he leaned back against the pillows on his hospital bed. The injection was over. At 8:20 a.m., so right after Rost's injection ended, the nurse began administering the drug to the volunteer on Rost's other side. Rost couldn't remember this man's name. All he knew is that he was an actor who had recently come back from Los Angeles, California on a vacation. And the nurse had just finished hooking up the IV when David, the first patient to receive the infusion, called out to her. David draped one arm across his eyes and told the nurse he had a migraine. The nurse told David she'd be right back, and then she walked out of the trial bay, and then a minute later, she came back with just a cold towel and laid it across David's forehead and then apologized to him. She told him that they couldn't give him any kind of pain reliever since it might affect the drug trial. Rost felt terrible for David, who just groaned and pressed the towel against his eyelids. And as Rost stared at David, Rost just hoped he wouldn't develop a migraine too. And so far, he felt fine. But the more he began to think about it, the more convinced he became that a migraine was actually forming. Rost began to feel panic rise in his chest, but a few minutes went by and his head actually felt basically fine. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. 25 more minutes ticked by, and at that point, all 4 of the volunteers in Rost's trial bay were hooked up to their IVs. Rost still felt fine, but David's migraine seemed to be getting much, much worse. Rost could see that David was sweating now. His skin had turned reddish, and David said he felt like he was burning up. Suddenly, David sat up just long enough to rip his shirt off, and then he collapsed back onto his bed, complaining about stabbing pain in his head. At this point, Rost was finding it impossible to distract himself. Around the room, everyone except for David seemed to be doing fine, but in his gut, Rost felt like something was wrong here. At 8:50 a.m., Dr. Bradford sat inside of Trial Bay 2, so not the trial bay that Rost was a part of, and the doctor sat next to volunteer number 6. And as he inserted an IV into the volunteer's arm, the nurse from Trial Bay 1 strode into the room and asked to speak with Dr. Bradford in private. The doctor stepped into the hallway with her and was surprised to hear that 3 of the volunteers in Bay 1 were experiencing migraines and pain in their lower backs. 2 of them were also running high temperatures and had begun vomiting. The 3rd volunteer was racked with chills and was shaking so badly it almost looked like he had hypothermia. Dr. Bradford immediately rushed past the nurse and hurried down the hallway to see what was going on in Trial Bay 1. The drug, TGN 1412, had tested so well in animals that he had complete confidence that today's trial would go smoothly. But when Dr. Bradford burst into Bay 1, he found a truly chaotic scene. David was writhing around in his bed, his body drenched in sweat. Meanwhile, 2 other volunteers were slumped over, vomiting into yellow biohazard bags. Like David, they were red and flushed and dripping with sweat. Then the smell of urine hit Dr. Bradford, and he realized the bed sheets around the room were wet with more than just sweat. Suddenly, the volunteer in bed number 3 sprang up and screamed that he wanted to go home. Before Dr. Bradford realized what was happening, the man tore the IV from his arm and made a dash for the door. Horrified, Dr. Bradford went running after him. The doctor finally caught up with the patient halfway down the hall. Dr. Bradford coaxed the man back into his bed, explaining that at this point, they couldn't let him leave for safety reasons. The patient would be putting his own health at risk, and besides, he seemed too weak to even make it out the front door of the building. Dr. Bradford looked around, totally stunned at Trial Bay 1. Vomit and urine were everywhere, and he could barely hear himself think over all the shouting. He'd been involved in over 300 clinical trials over the years, and he'd even volunteered himself in several clinical trials back when he was in med school. And in all that time, he had never seen this level of chaos and misery. But Dr. Bradford could not dwell on that now. 2 of the patients in the ward had bright red faces, and he could hear their monitor alarms chirping. The 2 volunteers were going into shock, which meant their organs weren't getting enough blood. If Dr. Bradford didn't act fast, they could have permanent organ damage, or they could even die. The nurses started pulling the curtain dividers around the beds to give the men and the medical team some privacy. Dr. Bradford immediately began ordering drugs that would help stabilize the patients. As he worked, he glanced up, and his eyes settled on volunteer number 2. His name was Rost Khan, one of their youngest volunteers. And unlike just about all the other volunteers, Rost seemed totally fine, although he had a terrified look on his face. 3 hours later, Rost still sat on his hospital bed, feeling absolutely horrified. The last thing he'd seen as the curtains were drawn around David was the stricken look on his face. Then, Rost had been forced to just listen for 3 hours as David and the other volunteers cried and screamed and vomited, filling the air with this awful smell. It sounded like they were fighting for their lives. Rost felt invisible as he heard nurses racing around the room, tending to the other 3 volunteers. He could hear similar screams coming from Trial Bay 2 next door as well. And all this time, Rost was thinking any second he was going to get sick like everybody else. Then, Rost heard footsteps approaching his bed. A nurse pulled back the curtains, and for the first time since that morning, he was able to see beyond his tiny cubicle. The other patients were still hidden behind their own privacy curtains, but he could see bodily fluids on the floor and walls, which explained the smell that would not go away. Across the room, somebody in a lab coat was tying up a yellow biohazard bag and rushing it out of the room. The nurse took the IV out of Rost's arm and removed the wires from his chest and told him he was safe. She said he should go grab some food in a neighboring conference room, and someone would be in shortly to explain what was happening. Rost was very shaken, but hearing the nurse tell him that everything was okay made relief flood over him so quickly that he almost felt lightheaded. But mostly what Rost felt is he was just so eager to get out of this foul-smelling room. Slowly, Rost got out of the bed and moved out the door and down the hallway to the conference room next door. There were some nice sandwiches on the table, which seemed to indicate that there had been a really nice catering order that had been arranged right before all this mayhem broke out in the trial base, because it had been totally untouched. But Rost was not hungry. He was just too rattled by what had just happened. So he just stood there, waiting for what seemed like forever. At first, he could still hear the blood-curdling wails coming from the other volunteers, but as he waited, the horrible sounds died down. Finally, around 12:30 p.m., a nurse entered the conference room and told Rost to collect his things. He was being sent home. He nodded and followed her back to the trial bay. But to his surprise, all of the patients were now gone. The bay was deathly quiet. Rost felt very uneasy as he collected his wallet and book from the nightstand. He just kept looking around the room, wondering where the volunteers had been taken, and whether they would even be okay. Around 8:30 p.m. that evening, Dr. Ganesh Sundaralingam entered the intensive care unit at Northwick Park, even though it was supposed to be his night off. In the middle of having dinner with his wife that night, he'd gotten a call from Dr. Bradford that they needed his help tonight treating some critically ill patients. And then he'd been shocked as Dr. Bradford explained that 6 volunteers from that day's clinical trial were in the intensive care unit, all in truly desperate shape. Dr. Bradford explained that they were the first people ever to receive the drug TGN 1412, so nobody knew why the patients were having such strong reactions. Dr. Bradford was basically dealing with an unknown illness, and the volunteers were falling apart quickly. He didn't have much time to put this puzzle together, so he had called Dr. Sundaralingam for help. Dr. Sundaralingam stopped at the ICU bed nearest the door. A volunteer from the drug trial, named David, so the man sitting next to Rost, was hooked up to a ventilator to help him breathe. David's body was swollen, his blood pressure was very low, and it was clear that his lungs were failing. He was one of the sickest patients that Dr. Sundaralingam had ever seen, and he knew that he would soon see 5 other men in a similar condition. Dr. Sundaralingam ordered a full battery of tests right away, and when the blood work came back, he could see that all 6 patients were going into kidney failure, which could be fatal. Now, obviously, this was a massive problem on its own, but it was a particularly big issue for this hospital, because this hospital didn't have enough dialysis machines to do the kidneys' work for all 6 of these volunteers. Dr. Sundaralingam began calling around to different hospitals asking for spare machines, and when he talked to them, he told them to please hurry. Then, Dr. Sundaralingam and his staff got to work trying to stabilize the patient's blood pressure. In all 6 cases, he could see that they were suffering from some kind of blood poisoning that was causing their blood pressures to drop. If it continued, all of them were at risk of more vital organs shutting down. For a moment, the doctor wondered if the trial drug was somehow contaminated. That was the only explanation he could think of that would cause blood poisoning in all 6 volunteers. Dr. Sundaralingam looked out the ICU window and saw blue and white ambulance lights zooming up the street. Then he heard commotion in the halls, and he knew that hospital staff were racing dialysis machines up to the ICU. Dr. Sundaralingam knew he needed to get out of the way, which gave him the perfect chance to race down to Dr. Bradford's office. He needed to see every last bit of paperwork they had on this drug, TGN 1412. 30 minutes later, Dr. Sundaralingam stood outside the ICU. He and Dr. Bradford had pored over the paperwork for TGN 1412 until they found a potential diagnosis. They saw that there was an extremely small risk that this drug could trigger an immune reaction known as a cytokine storm. Cytokine storm is extremely dangerous, leading to inflammation, high body temperature, organ failure, and rapid deterioration of healthy body tissues. It is absolutely a life-threatening condition. Now, the 2 doctors began to suspect that the volunteers were suffering cytokine storms right before their eyes. Luckily, there was a treatment for this condition, however, it was very risky. In fact, it presented the doctors with a life-or-death decision. And that's because the doctors were not 100% sure what was making these volunteers sick. It was possible they were suffering from cytokine storms, but they could also be suffering from blood poisoning due to contaminated drugs. And the treatments for those 2 conditions are almost exact opposites. If these men, these volunteers, had a cytokine storm, they would need a high dose of strong drugs to shut down their immune systems. But if this was a blood infection, well, those strong drugs, the immunosuppressant drugs, those would kill them, because their immune systems would now not be able to fight the poison. And there was no way for Dr. Sundaralingam to know for certain which condition was sickening the patients. He just had to make an educated guess and hope that he chose the right course of treatment. However, before making that guess, Dr. Sundaralingam took out his phone and began calling every colleague he trusted. And he walked them through the case, getting as many opinions as possible, because of course there was just no room for error here. If he didn't choose the correct treatment, there was a strong chance all the patients would die. He listened carefully to the advice of his colleagues, and then he knew it was time. It was now after midnight, and the nursing staff was really struggling to keep the patients stable much longer. Dr. Sundaralingam made his decision and ordered the treatment. Around 3:30 a.m. that morning, March 13th, Katrina Oakley's heart was racing as she climbed the hospital steps to the ICU. An hour earlier, her phone had woken her up. She'd purposely left the phone on loud in case her fiancé David called her from the hospital, where he was taking part in a clinical trial. He told her he would be totally safe, but she had still been worried. Except the call that had just woken her up was not a call from David. It was from a nurse asking her to come to the hospital right away. Something had gone wrong during the trial. Within minutes, Katrina had been running out the door. Just outside of the ICU, a nurse met Katrina and warned her that David might look a little different. He was being treated for something called a cytokine storm, which meant he was on a lot of drugs to suppress his immune system. and as a result, those drugs had caused some serious swelling. Katrina swallowed hard, doing her best to stay calm, but feeling very overwhelmed and confused. She had a million questions about David's condition and how any of this could have happened in the first place, but first, she just wanted to see David. She followed the nurse inside of the ICU to David's bedside. And right away, she saw her fiancé's face was so swollen, his eyes were like these little tiny slits, and his cheeks were so puffed up, his head looked like a beach ball. His stomach was also so huge and distended that at first, she thought he was resting his hands on his belly under the blankets. But he wasn't. His hands were by his side, and those too were very puffy. Plus, David's skin now had a yellow tint. Katrina took one of David's hands, and as she did, he turned to look at her, but his eyes were totally glazed over, like he couldn't really see her. Katrina had to fight the impulse to scream. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen to the perfectly healthy young man she had kissed goodbye just the day before. Just after dawn, Dr. Bradford drove into the Northwick Hospital parking lot and found news cameras waiting outside. Dr. Bradford hustled past them into the hospital and flipped on the television he kept in his office. Every channel was now talking about the catastrophic medical trial, calling these sick volunteers the Elephant Men because of how they had all swollen up like balloons. Dr. Bradford ran up the stairs to the ICU, where a nurse told him that 5 of the 6 patients were still in bad shape, but they were stable. However, the 6th patient was continuing to get worse, and in fact, he could die. And later that morning, Dr. Bradford learned that Scotland Yard was now investigating for any signs of foul play in this trial. But no matter how bad Dr. Bradford felt about this, and no matter what actually made these men sick, there really actually was not much Dr. Bradford could do for the patients now. Dr. Sunthuralingam was the intensive care specialist, not Dr. Bradford. So Dr. Bradford just went home, and for the next 2 days, he was glued to the news, checking repeatedly on the condition of the men. And finally, on the 3rd morning, Dr. Bradford learned that all 6 patients almost miraculously had improved overnight, and for the time being, it seemed like they could recover. And so that morning, Dr. Bradford decided to go into the hospital, but when he arrived at his office, he found that the office itself had been sealed off by police. An officer with Scotland Yard explained that the trial bays and his office were now part of a crime scene and off limits until the investigation was over. All Dr. Bradford could do was yet again go back home and wait, as Scotland Yard and British health inspectors conducted their investigation into the trial. But Dr. Bradford didn't really care about the implications of this investigation. All he was focused on was that the patients would pull through. That's all he wanted. And not even for his own sake, but just because he couldn't bear the thought of these volunteers dying because of his clinical trial. It was horrible. Thankfully, Dr. Sunthuralingam had made the right call. The TGN 1412 clinical trial volunteers had all developed cytokine storms, and the immunosuppressive drugs had saved their lives. But while Dr. Bradford was obviously thrilled to learn that all 6 patients would likely pull through, he still had no idea what could have triggered such a rare response to this drug. It would take them months, but the health inspectors would eventually discover why this had happened. It would turn out Dr. Bradford and his team were missing some crucial information, because even though this drug had been successfully tested on animals, those animals weren't capable of experiencing cytokine storms. So even though there was some preliminary clinical research showing that TGN 1412 might trigger cytokine storms in humans, it just had not been on Dr. Bradford's radar. And in the end, it actually was not really the drug that triggered this response. It was just how quickly the drug had been administered. The volunteers had received their entire dose of the drug in just 6 minutes, which actually was 10 times faster than it should have been given. And because Dr. Bradford and his team scheduled each patient's infusion just 10 minutes apart, the staff didn't have enough time to check each patient for immediate side effects before infusing the next patient. Had the drug been administered more slowly, it almost certainly would have been less of a shock to the system, and the cytokine storm likely would not have been triggered. On the morning of Tuesday, March 20th, about 9 days after the start of this trial, 4 of the 6 trial patients had improved enough to be transferred out of the ICU. But their immune systems were so depleted that they had to stay in the hospital for another 2 weeks. David Oakley made a full recovery in time for his wedding to Katrina. However, one volunteer, named Ryan, developed pneumonia, septicemia, and dry gangrene. As a result of the gangrene, his fingertips fell off, and part of his foot had to be amputated. As for Rost, he never got sick for one reason. He was the only person in his group to receive the placebo dose rather than the actual drug. As he watched the story of the Elephant Men unfold on national news, he knew he'd truly dodged a bullet. Eventually, David and some of the other trial volunteers who had gotten sick decided to file a lawsuit against Parexel, the company running the trial, and in 2009, they received an out-of-court settlement. In the wake of this failed medical trial, medical regulators made 22 recommendations to improve the safety of clinical trials, and these standards now apply throughout Europe. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there's a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, 3 brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the 3 brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the 3 brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning, they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town, and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party, eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 30,000 feet above the water, and in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight, and so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger, where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline, they hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body, and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby, nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers to decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack. And that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people after this story broke were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose, I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was, and he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter, and then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got, because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River, and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin. Or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley, and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp, and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river, and he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days, and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by, and now John's past due, and so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area, and so this partner contacted him, and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, you know, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death, and so there's no foul play here, and so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp, and there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it, and then he hears it again, and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. And so the police, they take this story down and they say, hey, this is what Annie looked like. And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description. And so universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night naked was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she had already been gone for months, and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decides to try their luck in Headless Valley, a man named Phil Powers. He makes his way into the valley. He finds a spot off of Flat River. He builds a cabin, and then shortly thereafter, his cabin burns to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, two more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, They entered the Headless Valley to try their luck, and shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin, and just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground, but William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold, and then when he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him, and they would find him inside of a sleeping bag laying down, decapitated right along the flat river inside of the Headless Valley. And so the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident where, he starved to death or he died of hypothermia, and then after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, and that's why we can't find it. And so the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. And so a search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River, some native tribes people came into their camp, and they warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river, they're out in the forest, they're kind of all around here, and so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribes people just left. And so the search party is absolutely horrified. They know about the rumors of this place. They're out here looking for someone that's gone missing in this place. And all night, all they hear are distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard in the previous nights. They're hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that are out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister, and that constant wailing they heard the night before, he said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley, but one could attribute that to the fact that far less people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park, but other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why.